innocent nurse, entered his bedroom to save his life, but the billionaire refused to let her leave. "You're mine forever." Hello, my beautiful family. Welcome back to another story that I know will touch your hearts deeply today. You know, every time I sit down to share these moments with you, I feel this incredible warmth, knowing that somewhere across the world, you're choosing to spend your precious time with me, and that means everything. Tonight's story is particularly special because it will show you that love always has a way of finding us when we think we have nothing left to offer the world. But before we begin, my family, there's good news. Can you believe we're almost at 2,000 subscribers? Our family is growing, and it just makes me so excited, because my birthday is also coming next month, on the 2nd of June. I'd be so happy to celebrate my 60th birthday with a strong 2,000 family. And my family, I know you can do it. I know you can make this little wish of mine come true. It would just end up being the best birthday gift I receive from you, my family. So if you love my stories, just take 10 seconds to like this video, comment where you're watching from at the moment, and tell me one book you need so badly, and I will order it from Amazon for you. Consider this my pre-birthday gift for my loyal family members here. I will be reading your comments and I will randomly choose only 5 winners. And finally, if you enjoy today's story, don't forget to share it with 5 of your friends. Let them also experience the daily love we share here. Now that you've done that, grab something warm to drink, settle in, and let me take you inside the walls of a Chicago penthouse, where a woman's professional duty becomes something far more dangerous and beautiful than either of them ever expected. The November rain hammered relentlessly against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Chicago penthouse, each drop creating rivers that distorted the city lights below. James Osborne lay motionless in his custom king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling. He had memorized every crack and imperfection of over the past 5 months. At 34, this real estate billionaire had built an empire of luxury hotels spanning 3 continents, commanded boardrooms with confidence, and negotiated million-dollar deals before breakfast. Now, he couldn't even transfer himself from bed to wheelchair without assistance. The horse-riding accident in June had shattered more than just his spine. It had shattered every illusion he held about the people in his life. The doctors called it a temporary paralysis, promising full recovery with proper rehabilitation and time. But James had discovered something far more devastating than physical limitations: the true nature of everyone who claimed to care about him. His phone sat silent on the nightstand, a stark contrast to the hundreds of daily calls and messages that once flooded in. Friends who had celebrated at his penthouse parties, who had toasted his successes and borrowed his vacation homes, suddenly developed mysterious scheduling conflicts when he needed support. These same people who had praised his business acumen now whispered behind closed doors about his unfortunate situation and whether he'd ever be the same again. Even worse were his own family members, his cousins, who had always sought his financial advice and investment opportunities, now questioned his mental capacity during family gatherings he could no longer attend. "Poor James," they would say, not knowing he could hear their phone conversations through his assistant. "Do you think he's still capable of making sound decisions? Maybe someone should have power of attorney." The business associates who had once courted his partnership and sought his approval now circled like vultures, sensing weakness. Board meetings continued without him. Decisions were made in his absence, and contracts were signed with barely a consultation. The empire he had built with his own hands was slowly being carved up by people who claimed to be protecting his interests. But the deepest cut came from discovering how quickly people could pivot from worship to pity, from admiration to abandonment. The accident had become a filter, separating those who loved James Osborne the person from those who had only ever loved James Osborne the success story. Of all the betrayals James endured, none stung quite like Victoria Manning's calculated disappearance. For 3 years this 29-year-old socialite had pursued him with the determination of a hunter tracking prey. Victoria came from old money, the kind of generational wealth that whispered rather than shouted, that attended charity galas and museum openings, that summered in the Hamptons and wintered in Aspen. She was everything his parents had ever wanted for him: blonde, beautiful, well-connected, and rich enough that no one could ever accuse her of being a gold digger. "She's perfect for you, James," his mother would gush during their weekly phone calls. Think of the empire you two could build together. Think of the social standing, the business connections, the beautiful children you'd have. But James had seen through Victoria's calculated perfection from the very beginning. He had watched her treat restaurant servers like they were invisible, snapping her fingers to get attention and never saying please or thank you. He had witnessed her speak condescendingly to her personal assistants, firing them over minor mistakes that any reasonable person would overlook. He had observed how she turned cold and dismissive toward anyone she deemed beneath her social status. If she can treat them like that, James had confided to his sister once, what makes anyone think she'd treat me differently if our positions were ever reversed? Victoria had tried everything to win him over. She invested heavily in his company, becoming a business partner despite his reluctance to mix personal and professional relationships. She charmed his parents during private dinners, painting herself as the ideal daughter-in-law who understood the responsibilities that came with wealth and status. She appeared coincidentally at his favorite restaurants, developed sudden interests in his hobbies, and threw herself into his social circle with determined enthusiasm. But every gesture felt calculated, every conversation seemed rehearsed, and every moment together left James feeling more isolated than before. Her advances at company parties were aggressive rather than charming. Her gifts were expensive but impersonal. Her declarations of affection felt like business proposals rather than genuine emotion. Then came the accident, and Victoria's true nature blazed forth like a neon sign in the darkness. Her visits to his bedside became sporadic within the first month, then stopped altogether by the third. Through his network of loyal employees, the few who remained genuinely loyal, James learned that Victoria was actively campaigning in board meetings, suggesting she should take temporary control of the company since poor James will never be the same, and was throwing good money after bad, chasing miracle cures. During her few obligatory visits, Victoria's eyes would flicker with barely concealed disgust when she looked at his weakened form, though she maintained a mask of concern whenever nurses or family members were present. "Oh, James," she would coo with false sympathy, her voice dripping with the kind of pity that felt more like condescension. "You're being so brave about all this. I'm sure you'll find a way to adapt to your new circumstances." Her words were carefully chosen, each one designed to sound supportive while actually reinforcing his limitations. She never spoke of recovery, only adaptation. She never mentioned the future they had supposedly been building, only his new reality. She never stayed longer than 20 minutes, always having some urgent social obligation that required her immediate attention. James never confronted her about the rumors of her boardroom manipulation or her obvious discomfort with his condition. What was the point? Her actions spoke louder than any denial ever could, and her absence spoke loudest of all. The parade of medical professionals through James's penthouse had become a running joke among his remaining staff, if anyone had been in the mood for humor. 6 nurses in 4 months, each one lasting no more than a few weeks before either quitting in frustration or being dismissed for various reasons. The first nurse, Patricia, had treated him like a fragile piece of china, speaking in hushed, reverent tones and tiptoeing around his room as if loud noises might shatter his spirit completely. She approached every task with excessive caution and constant apologies, making James feel more like an invalid than a person temporarily dealing with physical limitations. The second nurse, Robert, had maintained such clinical distance that James felt like a medical case study rather than a human being. Every interaction was purely professional, every conversation limited to medical necessity, every touch purely functional. There was no warmth, no personality, no recognition that healing involved more than just physical rehabilitation. The third and fourth nurses had been clearly motivated by his wealth rather than his well-being. They asked inappropriate questions about his assets, made comments about his lifestyle, and seemed more interested in taking photos of his penthouse than focusing on his care. One had actually asked if he was single and available, apparently viewing his vulnerability as an opportunity rather than a responsibility. The fifth nurse had been competent but pitying, constantly expressing sorrow for his tragic situation and treating him like a victim rather than a survivor. Her constant sympathy became suffocating, making James feel hopeless rather than hopeful about his recovery prospects. The sixth nurse had lasted only 3 days before James caught her going through his personal papers, claiming she was just trying to understand his financial stress levels for better care planning. After dismissing the sixth nurse, James had retreated into stubborn isolation, refusing his sister's suggestions for replacement caregivers and insisting he could manage on his own. This lasted exactly 1 week before his sister Rebecca took matters into her own hands. "James," she announced during one of her daily check-in calls, "I've found someone new, and before you start protesting, just listen. Her name is Isabella Boulton. She's a trauma nurse from Dallas, and she specializes in cases like yours. More importantly, she doesn't take no for an answer, and she doesn't put up with self-pity. Rebecca, I told you. You told me you don't want another nurse. I heard you, but what you need and what you want are two different things right now." Her voice carried the firm authority of an older sister who had watched her brother suffer for too long. "Give her 30 days. If she can't get you back on your feet, literally and figuratively, then I'll help you find the best long-term care facility in the country. But if you refuse to try one more time, I'm making that decision for you anyway." James wanted to argue, but something in Rebecca's tone told him this was not a negotiation. His sister had been one of the few people who hadn't abandoned him after the accident, and her patience was clearly running thin with his stubborn resistance to help. When James heard the elevator chime announcing a visitor that rainy Thursday afternoon, he expected another timid, overly sympathetic medical professional who would last perhaps a week before proving inadequate. Instead, his butler announced the arrival of someone who immediately commanded attention in a way that caught James completely off guard. Isabella Boulton entered his bedroom like a force of nature contained in human form. She had wild auburn curls that seemed to have a mind of their own, barely contained by what appeared to be a hastily constructed bun held together with 2 pencils and pure determination. Her emerald eyes seemed to see right through the defensive walls James had spent months constructing, and she carried an aura of controlled chaos that filled his sterile, perfectly organized room with unexpected energy. At 28, Isabella moved with the confident efficiency of someone who had spent years in high-pressure medical situations, but there was something else in her bearing, a warmth that hadn't been beaten down by difficult circumstances, a strength that came from overcoming rather than being overcome. "Mr. Osborne," she said, settling into the chair beside his bed without waiting for permission, her voice carrying traces of a Texas accent that spoke of authenticity rather than cultivation. "I'm Nurse Isabella Boulton, and I'm here because your sister is worried you're giving up on yourself." James's jaw tightened automatically. "My sister had no right to care about you," Isabella interrupted, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "From what I understand, you've fired 6 nurses in 4 months. That tells me 2 things. Either you're impossible to work with, or you haven't found anyone worth working with yet." The directness of her statement caught James off guard. None of the previous nurses had challenged him so immediately, so fearlessly. "So here's my proposal," Isabella continued, leaning forward slightly as if sharing a conspiracy. "Give me 30 days. If I can't get you back on your feet, literally and figuratively, I'll personally recommend you to the best long-term care facility in America. I'll even help you transition there myself. And if you succeed," James found himself asking, intrigued despite his determination to remain distant. Isabella's smile was both challenge and promise. "Then you pay me double my fee and admit that sometimes the person who can save you comes from the last place you'd expect to find them." Within 2 hours, Isabella had moved her personal belongings into the guest suite connected to James's master bedroom. "I work better when I'm close to my patients," she explained matter-of-factly, though something in her eyes suggested this arrangement was as unusual for her as it was unsettling for him. As she efficiently organized her medical supplies and personal items, James found himself studying this woman who had just turned his carefully controlled environment completely upside down. Isabella Boulton was unlike anyone who had ever entered his world, unpretentious, direct, comfortable in her own skin, and apparently immune to both his wealth and his defensive mechanisms. For the first time in 5 months, James Osborne felt something other than despair or anger. He felt curious about what the next 30 days might bring, and that curiosity felt dangerously close to hope. My family, before we dive deeper into Isabella and James's story, I want to know, have you ever had someone enter your life at exactly the moment you needed them most? Someone who saw potential in you when you couldn't see it yourself? Drop a comment and share that experience, because I believe we all have guardian angels who show up as ordinary people. And if this story is already touching your heart, hit that like button. It helps me know you're feeling the same emotions I felt while writing their incredible journey. The first week with Isabella Boulton was unlike anything James had experienced with his previous caregivers, where others had tiptoed around his mood swings and accommodated his every demand. Isabella treated him exactly like what he had become, a stubborn, spoiled man, throwing an extended tantrum because life hadn't gone according to his carefully laid plans. On her second morning, when James refused to get out of bed for his scheduled physical therapy session, Isabella didn't offer gentle encouragement or patient reasoning. Instead, she pulled back his expensive silk sheets without ceremony and announced, "The pity party is over. Mr. Osborne, time to get to work." "Excuse me," James sputtered, shocked by her audacity. "I pay your salary, and I decide when. You pay me to get you walking again, not to enable your self-destruction." Isabella interrupted, her Texas accent becoming more pronounced when she was irritated. "And right now, you're doing my job for me by proving exactly why the last 6 nurses couldn't help you. You don't want a caregiver, you want an audience for your suffering." James glared at her with the full force of authority he'd once wielded in boardrooms. "You have no idea what I've been through. You don't understand the scope of what I've lost. Stop." Isabella's voice cut through his protest like a blade. "Stop feeling sorry for yourself. I've worked with patients who had nothing, no money, no family, no insurance, no hope, and they fought harder for their recovery than you're fighting right now. You know what the difference is between them and you?" "Enlighten me," James said coldly. "They knew that giving up meant losing everything. You think you've already lost everything, so you've decided there's no point in fighting." Isabella moved closer to his bed, her emerald eyes blazing with frustration. "But here's what you're really scared of, and it has nothing to do with whether you'll walk again." James felt his defensive walls trembling under her direct gaze. "You don't know what you're talking about. You're not scared of being paralyzed, James. You're scared of discovering who your real friends are. You're terrified that if you get better, you'll have to face the fact that most of the people in your life only cared about what you could do for them, not who you actually are." The accuracy of her observation hit James like a physical blow. In 1 week, this woman had seen through defenses that had taken him months to construct, had identified fears he hadn't even admitted to himself. "So you're choosing to stay broken," Isabella continued relentlessly, "because being broken gives you an excuse not to face that truth. Well, I'm not going to let you hide behind your injuries anymore. Starting tomorrow, we do this the hard way." That night, as James lay staring at his ceiling, Isabella's words echoed in his mind. She was right, and he hated her for it. But for the first time since the accident, someone had seen through his pain to the real issues underneath, and that recognition felt dangerously close to relief. The shift in their dynamic became apparent during their 3rd week together. Isabella had established a routine that pushed James harder than any previous caregiver, but she also lingered longer during his evening care, their conversations stretching well past medical necessity. One particularly difficult night, when James had struggled through an especially challenging therapy session, he found himself studying Isabella's face as she updated his medical charts by lamplight. The soft glow revealed the exhaustion she tried to hide during daylight hours, the subtle lines of concentration that spoke of someone who took her responsibilities seriously. "Why are you really here, Isabella?" James asked quietly, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "You could work anywhere, make more money in private practice, work with easier patients. Why take on someone like me?" Isabella paused in her note-taking, her pen hovering over the page. For a moment, James thought she might deflect the question with professional courtesy, but then she looked directly at him with an honesty that caught him off guard. "Because healing isn't about the money," she said simply. "It's about seeing potential where others see hopelessness. It's about believing someone can be more than their worst moment, more than their biggest failure, more than their deepest fear." That sounds like something you'd say to all your patients, James observed, though without the cynicism he might have used weeks earlier. Isabella shook her head. I've seen what fair-weather friends can do to a person's spirit, James. I've watched good people give up on themselves because everyone around them gave up first. And I've learned that sometimes the best healing happens when someone believes in you just because of who you are, not what you can do for them. Something in her voice told James she was speaking from personal experience, that her understanding of betrayal and abandonment came from her own journey rather than just professional observation. Who gave up on you? He asked gently. Isabella's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing vulnerability she rarely allowed others to see. That's a story for another night, she said softly. But let's just say I understand what it feels like when people you trust decide you're not worth the effort anymore. In that moment, James realized that Isabella Boulton wasn't just his nurse. She was someone who understood his pain from the inside, someone who had survived her own version of abandonment and chosen to use that experience to help others heal. The moment that changed everything between them happened during James's 5th week of recovery. On a Tuesday afternoon when Chicago's winter wind rattled the penthouse windows, Isabella was helping James practice transferring from his bed to his wheelchair, a movement that required upper body strength he was still rebuilding and coordination that sometimes failed him at crucial moments. Remember to engage your core, Isabella coached, standing close enough to assist but far enough away to let him work independently. Use your momentum, don't fight it. James gripped the wheelchair arms, his muscles trembling with effort as he attempted the transfer. For a moment it seemed like he would succeed. His body lifted, shifted, began the careful descent toward the wheelchair seat. Then his weakened arms gave out completely. Instead of crashing to the floor as he expected, James found himself caught against Isabella's chest, her arms wrapped protectively around him, her body bearing his weight without hesitation. For a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity, neither of them moved. James became acutely aware of Isabella's heartbeat against his cheek, steady and strong. He could smell the subtle scent of her hair, something clean and warm that spoke of authenticity rather than expensive perfumes. He could feel the gentle strength in her embrace, the way she held him not like a patient who had fallen, but like a person who mattered. When their eyes met, the professional distance Isabella had maintained for weeks cracked like ice under spring sun. James saw something in her gaze that had nothing to do with medical care and everything to do with the connection that had been building between them despite all their efforts to keep it purely professional. I should, Isabella began, but her voice was barely a whisper. James lifted his hand to touch her face, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek with infinite gentleness. Don't, he whispered back. Don't pretend you don't feel this too. Isabella stepped back, but not before James saw the truth, written clearly in her emerald eyes. The walls they had both constructed were crumbling, and they both knew it. James, I'm your nurse, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. There are boundaries we can't cross, professional ethics, medical standards, boundaries I never asked for, James replied quietly. Isabella, in 5 months, you're the first person who's looked at me and seen more than a broken man. You're the first person who's stayed when staying got difficult. The air between them crackled with unspoken possibilities, with feelings neither had planned but both could no longer deny. They stood there suspended between professional duty and personal truth, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything between them forever. After the wheelchair incident, everything between James and Isabella changed in ways both subtle and profound. The professional boundaries that had defined their relationship for weeks began to blur like watercolors in rain, creating something entirely new and infinitely more complex. Isabella still maintained her medical duties with the same dedication and expertise, but now their interactions carried an undercurrent of awareness that neither could ignore. When she checked his blood pressure, her fingers would linger on his wrist just a moment longer than necessary. When she helped him with physical therapy exercises, their eyes would meet and hold, conversations happening in silence that neither dared speak aloud. Their evening sessions, once strictly focused on medical necessity, began stretching into hours-long conversations about everything except the growing attraction between them. James found himself sharing stories about his childhood, his dreams before business consumed his life, his fears about what the future might hold. Isabella reciprocated with tales of growing up in San Antonio, the sacrifices her family made for her education, and the patients who had taught her that healing was as much about hope as it was about medicine. "You know," James said one evening, as Isabella adjusted his pillows, "I used to think these sessions were about getting my body back. Now I realize they're about getting myself back." Isabella paused in her work, meeting his gaze with an intensity that made his breath catch. "Maybe that was always the real injury," she said softly. "Not your spine, but your spirit." The most significant change was in James's motivation during therapy. Where once he had participated reluctantly, going through the motions to satisfy medical requirements, now he pushed himself harder than any of his previous caregivers had ever demanded. But his drive wasn't coming from a desire to prove something to himself or to silence his critics. He was working harder because he wanted to see the pride that lit up Isabella's face when he achieved small victories. He wanted to earn the smile that transformed her entire expression when he exceeded expectations. He wanted to be worthy of the faith she had placed in him when no one else believed in his recovery. "Excellent," Isabella would breathe when he completed a particularly difficult exercise, and James would feel a warmth that had nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with earning her approval. Their growing intimacy revealed itself in 1,000 small moments. The way Isabella's hand would find his shoulder when she passed behind his wheelchair, offering comfort that went beyond professional care. The way James would time his therapy sessions to coincide with the late afternoon light that made Isabella's auburn hair shine like fire. The way they both began inventing reasons to extend their time together, finding medical justifications for conversations that were becoming increasingly personal. "I should check your reflexes again," Isabella would say, though they both knew his reflexes had been perfectly normal for weeks. "I think I need help with my range of motion exercises," James would respond, though his mobility had improved dramatically and they both knew he could perform most movements independently. These small deceptions became their way of stealing moments together without crossing the professional lines that still technically defined their relationship, though those lines were becoming more hypothetical with each passing day. The breakthrough that shattered their remaining pretenses happened during James's 7th week of recovery, on a Friday morning when Isabella had challenged him to attempt standing without any assistive devices. Previous attempts had lasted only seconds before his legs gave out, but weeks of intensive therapy had gradually rebuilt his strength and coordination. "Remember," Isabella coached from nearby, close enough to catch him if he fell but far enough away to let him succeed independently. "Trust your body. It remembers how to do this." James gripped the parallel bars they had installed in his room, took a deep breath, and slowly shifted his weight forward. His legs trembled with effort as he pushed himself upright, muscles remembering movements they hadn't performed in months. For 10 seconds he stood shakily but independently, then 20 seconds, then 30. "James," Isabella whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "look at you." At 45 seconds James was still standing, his face flushed with exertion but his eyes bright with triumph. When he finally lowered himself back to his wheelchair, Isabella's professional composure shattered completely. She threw her arms around him in celebration, her joy overflowing in a way that had nothing to do with medical achievement and everything to do with personal investment in his success. "I knew you could do it," she whispered against his shoulder, her voice breaking with emotion. "I always knew you could do it." When she pulled back to look at him, tears streaming down her cheeks, James cupped her face in his hands with infinite tenderness. "Isabella," he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and something deeper, "I need to tell you something that has nothing to do with my recovery and everything to do with what you've meant to me these past weeks." "James," she began, but he continued, "I could have hired any nurse, paid any amount, gotten the best medical care money could buy anywhere in the world, but none of that would have mattered without you." His thumbs traced the tears on her cheeks. "I'm not talking about your medical skills, though they're extraordinary. I'm talking about the way you challenge me, frustrate me, make me want to be better than I thought I could be." Isabella's breath caught as she realized what he was building toward. "I'm talking about the fact that I'm falling in love with you," James said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "For 3 years I had someone chasing me, who saw only my bank account and social status. The moment I lost my ability to walk, she disappeared like smoke. But you saw me at my absolute lowest, and still believed I could rise again. James, you don't understand what you're saying, Isabella said, stepping back even as her heart raced. I'm not from your world. I grew up in a one-bedroom apartment in San Antonio. I put myself through nursing school working 3 jobs, waitressing, house cleaning and stocking shelves at a grocery store. People like you don't. People like me. James interrupted gently. Isabella, before the accident, I surrounded myself with people who only saw my wealth and status. You're the first person who's ever cared more about who I am than what I have. You stayed when everyone else ran. The silence that followed James's declaration stretched between them like a bridge. Neither was sure they dared cross. Isabella stood frozen, her professional training warring with emotions she had tried desperately to suppress for weeks. You don't understand what you're saying, she repeated, but her voice lacked conviction. James, I've seen your world. I've watched how people like Victoria move through it. I don't belong there. James's expression softened with understanding. You're right, you don't belong in that world. Thank God for that. He reached for her hands, grateful when she didn't pull away. Isabella, that world is full of people who loved me for what I could give them, what I could do for them, what I represented to their social status. You're the first person who's ever loved me for who I am when I have nothing left to offer. I never said I loved you, Isabella whispered, though her words carried no denial. You didn't have to say it, James replied gently. I see it in the way you fight for my recovery like it's your own battle. I hear it in your voice when you talk about my progress. I feel it in the way you hold me when I'm struggling, like you'd take on my pain if you could. Isabella's composure finally cracked. Of course I love you, she admitted, tears flowing freely now. How could I not? But loving you and being able to be with you are 2 completely different things. Why? James asked simply. Because I'm your nurse. Because people will say I took advantage of you when you were vulnerable. Because your family expects someone like Victoria. Because James silenced her with a kiss that was gentle, desperate, and full of weeks of suppressed longing. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. Because none of that matters, James finished for her. Isabella, you're the first person who cared more about who I am than what I have. You're the first person who stayed when staying got difficult. You're the first person who made me want to get better, not to prove something to the world, but to be worthy of the faith you placed in me. Isabella searched his eyes, looking for any sign that this was gratitude masquerading as love, any hint that his emotions were compromised by his vulnerable state. Instead, she saw the same certainty she felt in her own heart. This changes everything, she whispered. Yes, James agreed, pulling her closer. It changes everything. We're no longer nurse and patient. We're 2 people who found each other when we both needed finding most. As they held each other in the late morning light streaming through the Penthouse windows, both knew they had crossed a line from which there would be no return. Whatever came next, they would face it together, no longer bound by professional obligations but united by something far more powerful and infinitely more dangerous. Meanwhile, word of James's remarkable recovery had spread through Chicago's elite social circles like wildfire through dry grass. The man who had been written off by his former associates, dismissed as a broken shadow of his former self, was not only walking again, but reportedly stronger and more focused than ever before. The whispers that had once carried pity and malicious joy derived from observing his misfortune now carried curiosity and, in some cases, regret. It was inevitable that this news would reach Victoria Manning's perfectly manicured ears. On a crisp Thursday afternoon in December, exactly 3 months since her last visit to the penthouse, Victoria announced her arrival with the sharp staccato of designer heels clicking authoritatively across the marble floors. She swept into James's bedroom like a queen returning to reclaim her rightful throne, her platinum blonde hair perfectly styled, her winter white cashmere coat draped elegantly over her shoulders. "James, darling," she exclaimed, her voice pitched with carefully calibrated enthusiasm that hadn't been present during her sparse visits months earlier. "I heard the most wonderful news about your progress. You look absolutely incredible." Isabella, who had been helping James with his afternoon strengthening exercises, immediately sensed the shift in atmospheric pressure that Victoria's presence brought. This was clearly the woman James had mentioned in passing, the one who had vanished when his condition seemed hopeless, only to reappear now that recovery was not just possible, but proven. Victoria's calculating gaze swept over Isabella with the dismissive efficiency of someone cataloguing furniture, noting her presence but assigning her no particular importance. The socialite's entire focus centered on James with an intensity that felt both possessive and predatory. "Victoria," James said, his voice carefully neutral as he continued his exercises without pause. "It's been, 3 months since your last visit. Oh, you know how absolutely crazy things have been at the office." Victoria laughed, the sound like expensive crystal being tapped with a silver spoon. "But I've been thinking about you constantly, and when I heard about your recovery, I simply had to come see this miracle for myself." The lie rolled off her tongue, with such practiced ease that Isabella almost admired the performance. "Almost. I always knew you'd overcome this little setback," Victoria continued, settling into the chair that had become Isabella's usual spot during their sessions. "You're far too strong, too determined to let something like this keep you down permanently. I told everyone who would listen that James Osborne doesn't know the meaning of defeat." Isabella watched James's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. She had spent enough time studying his expressions to recognize the controlled anger that flickered across his features before he schooled them back to neutrality. "How generous of you to defend my character," James said with dangerous quietness, "especially since you weren't here to witness any of this recovery firsthand." Victoria's perfect composure flickered for just a moment, so briefly that someone who didn't know her well might have missed it entirely. But Isabella caught the flash of calculation in her eyes, the quick assessment of how much ground she had lost, and how quickly she needed to regain it. "Darling, you know I would have been here every single day if circumstances had permitted," Victoria said, her voice dripping with false regret. "But someone had to hold everything together while you focused on getting better. Someone had to make the difficult decisions, handle the board meetings, manage the day-to-day operations of your empire." "My empire," James repeated slowly, as if tasting the words for poison. "Well, yes," Victoria said, moving closer to his bed with the calculated grace of a dancer. "Our empire, really. We've always made such an incredible team, James. Your vision, my connections, our combined resources, we've built something truly extraordinary together." Isabella continued organizing medical supplies with steady hands, but every word was burning itself into her memory. This woman had abandoned James when he needed support most, yet now that recovery seemed possible, she was back to claim her place in his success story. Victoria's approach was masterfully executed. Like a chess player who had spent months planning this particular gambit, she didn't immediately address the obvious question of her prolonged absence. Instead, she focused on the future, painting pictures of the empire they could build together now that James was back to his old self. "Your parents have been asking about us constantly," Victoria said, her voice carrying just the right note of intimate familiarity. "They're so hoping we'll finally make things official once you're fully recovered. Your mother called me just last week, practically begging me to be patient with you during this difficult transition." Isabella's hands stilled on the medication bottles she was organizing. She had known this moment would come, when James's old world would attempt to reclaim him, when the people who had abandoned him during his lowest point would return with expectations and demands. Victoria's voice took on a tone of gentle concern as she glanced meaningfully at Isabella. "James, darling, everyone's talking about your unconventional recovery arrangement here. Your nurse moving into your bedroom, the unusual intimacy of your care situation. People are beginning to question whether you're thinking clearly during such a vulnerable time in your life." The implication hung in the air like poison gas, invisible but deadly. "Are you suggesting I'm not competent to make my own decisions?" James asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Of course not," Victoria replied smoothly. "I'm simply suggesting that mixing medical care with personal feelings rarely ends well for anyone involved. Perhaps it's time to transition to more appropriate arrangements, someone more professional." Isabella's blood ran cold, but she maintained her composure, continuing to organize supplies with steady hands even as her heart began to shatter. "After all," Victoria continued, her gaze fixed on Isabella with barely concealed hostility, You wouldn't want people to think your judgment has been compromised by gratitude or other emotions that might arise during such an intimate caregiving relationship. A man in your position needs to be especially careful about who he allows close to him, particularly when that person might have ulterior motives. The accusation was delivered with surgical precision, never stated directly but impossible to misunderstand. Victoria was suggesting that Isabella had manipulated James's vulnerable state for personal gain, that their relationship was built on exploitation rather than genuine feeling. Think about your reputation, James, Victoria pressed. Think about what this looks like to your investors, your business partners, your family. A billionaire real estate mogul falling for his live-in nurse. It's the kind of story that tabloids dream about, the kind of scandal that can destroy careers and reputations that took decades to build. Standing just outside the doorway where she had gone to retrieve additional supplies, Isabella heard every calculated word. The implication was crystal clear. She was being painted as a gold digger who had taken advantage of a vulnerable man, a manipulative caregiver who had crossed professional boundaries for financial gain. The accusations cut deep because they echoed every fear Isabella had harbored about their relationship since the moment she first acknowledged her feelings for James. Every doubt she had suppressed, every worry she had pushed aside, came flooding back with the force of a tsunami. She had fallen in love with a patient. She had crossed professional boundaries. She had allowed personal feelings to compromise her medical judgment. And now, no matter what her true motivations had been, the world would always see her as someone who had taken advantage of a man during his most vulnerable moments. That night, after Victoria had finally left with promises to discuss the company's future very soon, Isabella began quietly packing her personal belongings. Her hands trembled as she folded clothes into her suitcase, each item representing another step away from the life she had briefly allowed herself to envision. The sound of James's wheelchair approaching her doorway made her freeze, but she didn't turn around. "What are you doing?" James asked, though the answer was obvious from the suitcase on her bed and the careful way she was folding her belongings. Isabella didn't look up from her packing. "She's right, you know. People will always question my motives, your judgment. I won't be responsible for damaging your reputation or giving people ammunition to use against you." "My reputation," James laughed bitterly, though there was no humor in the sound. "Isabella, 6 months ago, I thought my reputation was everything. Now I realize it's worthless if I'm living a lie to maintain it." Isabella finally turned to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Don't you see, I fell in love with you too. That's the problem. How can I be your nurse when all I want is to be in your arms? How can I provide professional care when every touch makes me want more? And now people like Victoria will always say I took advantage of you when you were vulnerable." "Then don't be my nurse anymore," James said simply, moving closer despite her obvious distress. "Be my partner, be my equal, be the woman I choose to spend my life with, not because you healed my body, but because you saw my worth when everyone else saw only my limitations." Isabella shook her head, fresh tears falling. "Your family expects Victoria, your business world expects Victoria. She's from your social class, your financial level, your world. I'm just a nurse from San Antonio who worked 3 jobs to pay for school. And she abandoned me the moment I needed her most," James said firmly. "Isabella, you stayed. You fought for me when I wouldn't fight for myself. You loved me when I was broken. That's worth more than all of Victoria's family money and social connections combined." Isabella stood torn between the love that filled her heart and the fear that threatened to destroy them both. In her silence, James saw both her answer and her terror, and he knew that words alone would never be enough to convince her. Sometimes love required public declaration, required risking everything to prove its worth. The next morning, James made a decision that shocked everyone in his inner circle. He called an emergency board meeting for that afternoon, insisting that all major shareholders and company officers attend. Despite Isabella's frantic protests, he insisted she be present as well. "James, I can't be there," Isabella pleaded. "After yesterday with Victoria, people will see exactly who you are," James replied with quiet determination. "They'll see the woman who saved my life in every way that counts, and they'll understand why I'm willing to risk everything for you. Besides, you also have to be close to me in case I fall. remember. His tone matter-of-factly, though she knew he just used that as a final excuse, knowing she wouldn't have any choice. The boardroom at Osborne Enterprises had been the site of countless million-dollar deals, hostile takeovers and corporate power plays, but nothing had prepared the assembled executives for what they witnessed that December afternoon. James entered the room standing tall, using only minimal support from a walking cane, a sight that stunned those who had assumed he would never walk again. The murmur of surprised voices filled the space as board members who had written him off mentally scrambled to reassess their positions. Isabella followed reluctantly, taking a seat in the back of the room despite James's invitation to sit closer. She felt every eye in the room evaluating her, measuring her, finding her wanting. "Ladies and gentlemen," James began, his voice carrying the authority that had once commanded this room effortlessly. "6 months ago, I had everything money could buy and nothing that actually mattered. I was surrounded by people who claimed to care about me, but when I needed them most, they revealed their true nature." His gaze swept the room, stopping briefly on several faces that couldn't meet his eyes. "Some of you wrote me off. Some of you spoke about taking control of my company behind my back. Some of you disappeared entirely when you thought I had nothing left to offer." Victoria, who sat in her usual place at the table, had gone pale but maintained her composure with practiced determination. "But one person saw potential in me when I'd given up on myself," James continued, looking directly at Isabella, who sat frozen in the back of the room. "Isabella Boulton saved my life, not just medically, but in every way that counts. She challenged me when everyone else pitied me. She stayed when others ran. She loved me when I couldn't love myself." Murmurs rippled through the room as board members glanced between James, Isabella, and Victoria, beginning to understand the true purpose of this gathering. "I know what some of you are thinking," James said firmly, "that this is inappropriate, that I'm not thinking clearly, that I've been manipulated during a vulnerable time. But I've never been more clear about anything in my life." What happened next would become legendary in Chicago business circles for years to come. James Osborne, billionaire real estate mogul, who had been presumed permanently disabled just months earlier, walked slowly but determinedly toward the back of the room where Isabella sat. Reaching her chair, James did something that made the entire room gasp collectively. He lowered himself to one knee, a physical feat that months earlier would have been impossible and even now required tremendous strength and balance. "Isabella Boulton," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence, "you entered my bedroom to save my life. You stayed when fair-weather friends fled. You loved me not for what I could give you but for who I am at my core." Victoria stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "James, this is ridiculous. You're throwing away everything we could build together for a woman who actually loves me," James finished, never taking his eyes off Isabella. "Not my bank account, not my social status, not what I can do for her career, but me." He took Isabella's hands in his, both of them trembling with emotion and the magnitude of the moment. "I'm asking you to stay forever, not as my caregiver but as my wife. Not because I need you to heal me, but because I choose you. Because you chose me when choosing me meant choosing someone broken." Isabella looked into his eyes, seeing not the billionaire who commanded boardrooms, but the man who had fought his way back from despair with her help, who was now risking everything: his business relationships, his family's expectations, his social standing, all for love. Her answer came not in words but in action. She dropped to her knees beside him, their foreheads touching, as tears of joy streamed down both their faces. "You impossible, stubborn, wonderful man," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you, not because you're rich, not because you need me, but because I choose you, every difficult, challenging, beautiful part of you." Victoria stormed out, her heels clicking angrily across the marble, but James barely noticed. The board members sat in stunned silence, but James didn't care about their approval anymore. He had found something worth more than their acceptance, more valuable than their respect, more precious than any business empire he could ever build. He had found love that chose him not, despite his brokenness, but because of the strength that brokenness had revealed. James just risked everything: his business relationships, his social standing, even his physical strength, all for love. "But here's what I want to know from you, my family. Do you think he made the right choice? Would you have the courage to choose love over social expectations? And Isabella, she could have stayed silent and safe, but she chose to trust her heart. Drop a comment and let me know your thoughts. If this story is moving you the way it moved me, don't hesitate to share it with someone who needs to believe that true love still exists. Let's continue. 3 months later, their intimate ceremony took place in the garden of James's Chicago penthouse on a perfect March afternoon, when spring was just beginning to chase away the last traces of winter. Cherry blossoms bloomed in delicate pink clouds, creating a natural cathedral that felt infinitely more sacred than any grand venue money could have bought. Only 37 people attended, a stark contrast to the 500-person guest list. James's parents had initially proposed. Every person present had earned their invitation through loyalty during the darkest months, through staying when others left, through seeing worth in both James and Isabella when the world questioned their judgment. Rebecca, James's sister, stood as maid of honor, the woman whose stubborn love had brought Isabella into their lives in the first place. Her tears of joy fell freely as she watched her brother exchange vows with the woman who had given him back not just his mobility, but his capacity to trust in love again. The notable absences spoke as loudly as the presence of those who came. Victoria Manning was spending the weekend in the Hamptons, posting carefully curated photos of her fabulous life on social media, while avoiding any mention of the wedding that had dominated Chicago society gossip for weeks. James's parents had reluctantly attended, their disappointment obvious but their love for their son stronger than their social expectations. Several former business associates had sent regrets, still uncertain whether James's recovery and new marriage represented strength or weakness in their calculating minds. But none of that mattered to James and Isabella as they spoke vows they had written themselves, promising not just to love each other in sickness and health, but to see each other's wholeness even in moments of brokenness, to choose each other daily regardless of what the world might think or say. During their first dance, James led Isabella across the makeshift dance floor with smooth, confident steps that would have seemed miraculous to anyone who had seen him 6 months earlier. He was completely healed, his recovery so thorough that even his doctors called it extraordinary. "You know," James whispered as they swayed together to music played by a small string quartet, "Victoria was right about one thing. I wasn't thinking clearly when I fell in love with you." Isabella looked up at him with sudden concern, a flicker of old fear crossing her features. "What do you mean?" James's smile was tender and full of certainty. "I was thinking with my heart for the first time in my life, and my heart knew what my mind took months to understand, that you were exactly what I needed, exactly when I needed you most." Isabella's relief transformed into joy as she understood his meaning. "Your heart was smarter than both of us," she said, pulling him closer. "Much smarter," James agreed, spinning her gently as the music swelled around them. As the evening wound down and their guests began to depart, James and Isabella found themselves alone on the terrace, the city lights twinkling below them like earthbound stars. Isabella had changed from her wedding dress into a simple white sundress, her auburn curls loose around her shoulders, looking more beautiful than James had ever seen her. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Isabella asked, leaning against the terrace railing. "If you hadn't had the accident, if your sister hadn't called me, if I hadn't agreed to take the case." James joined her at the railing, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "I think about it all the time," he said honestly, "and I realize that the accident was the greatest blessing of my life." Isabella turned in his arms, studying his face with the intensity she'd shown when she was still his nurse. "How can you say that? You lost so much, your mobility, your independence, people you thought were friends." "I lost things that were never real to begin with," James corrected gently. "The accident stripped away everything superficial and revealed what was actually true. It showed me who my real friends were. It taught me that healing isn't just about medicine. It's about love that sees potential where others see hopelessness." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the cheekbones he had memorized during countless hours of recovery. "Most importantly, it brought me you, not because you fixed what was broken in my body, but because you helped me discover I was never broken at all, just waiting for the right person to help me become whole." Isabella's eyes filled with tears of gratitude and overwhelming love. "We healed each other," she whispered. "Yes," James agreed, kissing her forehead with infinite tenderness. "We did." As they held each other under the starlit Chicago sky, both understood a truth that would guide their marriage through whatever challenges lay ahead. Real love doesn't come to rescue you from your problems. It comes to stand beside you while you find the strength you never knew you had. Sometimes the person who can save you comes from the last place you'd expect to find them. And sometimes the greatest healing happens when someone loves you enough to help you discover that you were never broken, just waiting for the right heart to recognize your wholeness. Their love story had begun with a professional arrangement between a billionaire who had lost everything that mattered and a nurse who believed in potential others couldn't see. It had transformed into something neither had planned but both had needed. A partnership built, not on what they could do for each other, but on who they became when they chose to love without conditions, without reservations, without fear. In the end, Isabella had entered James's bedroom to save his life. What neither of them expected was that he would save hers in return, creating a love story that proved true healing begins not when someone fixes your brokenness, but when they love you enough to see your strength. My beautiful family, as I finish Isabella and James's story tonight, I want you to remember something. Isabella didn't fix James. She simply saw his wholeness when he could only see his brokenness. And James didn't save Isabella from her humble beginnings. He chose to build a future where her worth wasn't measured by her bank account. Tonight, before you sleep, I want you to think about the Isabellas and Jameses in your own life, the people who stayed when others left, the ones who saw your potential when you felt powerless. And maybe, just maybe, you'll realize that you are someone's Isabella, someone's reason to believe in love again. Until our next story, remember, you are worthy of a love that chooses you not, despite your struggles, but because of the strength those struggles revealed. Sweet dreams, my forever family.